This little $25 wired remote control has solved most of my focusing issues with my Panasonic GH5, or at least how I use my Panasonic GH5. And if you, like me, are still using a GH5 in the year 2025, and you're still not ever going to rely on its autofocus and therefore just always use manual focus, then this remote might help you too. So I wanted to share this because this remote has been working very well for me, but out of the probably over 100 or so videos that I watched on the GH5 in the past 5 or 6 years after I got it, I never saw anyone talking about this solution. And since I plan on keeping and continuing to use my GH5, I wanted to talk about this wired remote control, and it's the Fotga RM-VP1. It connects to the GH5's 2.5mm remote control port on the grip side of the GH5, and then along with changing some settings in the camera's menu, I can sit where I need to and then half press the shutter button on the remote. The camera focuses on my face, but then when I release the shutter button, the focus stays there and I can get to recording more quickly. And you can even start and stop recording with the remote, as well as, I'm assuming, zoom in or out with the zoom rocker on the remote if you have a power zoom lens on your GH5, but I don't have any micro four thirds power zoom lenses. I'm pretty much always using the Panasonic 12mm prime lens on my GH5, so no zooming for me, but I'm sure that would work if you did have a power zoom lens. And with self-filming, which is how I use my GH5, especially at the distance that I need to be for this view, I can kind of reach the camera, but I can't reach the screen on the camera to set a focus point on my face. And I can't really reach the manual focus ring on the lens either without, kind of contorting myself to try to keep my face in position. I mean, my arms are pretty long, but not quite long enough, even with this 12mm lens, if I want to keep my face where it needs to be in focus. And most of the time, my teleprompter is also blocking my ability to even touch the screen or the lens. And here, I'll show you that. Get this other camera here. You can see right here that I can't really get to the screen or the lens because my teleprompter is just completely blocking that view. So this remote helps me get around my studio problems, if you will. So if my camera or lens loses its focus position at any time, like when the camera loses power and I turn it back on, I usually have to boot up the iPad app and connect the iPad to the GH5's Wi-Fi and then set my focus point manually. And that works just fine most of the time, but I not only have to get my iPad usually out of my bag, but there were times when the Panasonic app just would not connect to the GH5 and I would have to reboot the camera and try again. And that just slowed down my ability to get recording and was just frustrating at times. And this little remote just speeds that process up because there is no connecting. It's plugged in, you hit the button, and you're off to the races. Now, yes, the GH5 does have a menu option that will hold the focus position of the lens after you turn the camera off and back on again when you're using a focus by wire lens. But that setting is saved in the camera itself, and if you take the battery out or disconnect the external power from the dummy battery, and you'll have to reset the focus position when you give the camera a new power source. So this lens hold setting isn't foolproof. It's still a great camera, it records well, I like the look I get out of it, so I have no need to get rid of it. But if you want to use this wired remote, you'll need to do a couple of things to get it set up properly, so let's go through that. Oh, and first things first, the remote has a 1 meter cable on it that is a fixed length. So for this solution, if you are self-filming, you'll have to be within that 1 meter length of the cable. So with that out of the way, let's go through the rest of it. So obviously, number one, connect the Fotga remote to the 2.5mm port on the grip side of the camera and be sure to push it all the way in, as I had some confusion when the remote wasn't working at first, but the plug just wasn't quite seated all the way into the port and making the proper connections. Number two, assuming like me, you're going to be using this for video, you'll need to be in video mode on the camera. So set that on the dial on the top, and my camera is pretty much always in movie mode anyway, but the remote still does work for photos, for remote focus and shutter release. So you can take pictures when the camera is in photo mode if you want to use the Fotga wired remote that way. Number three, on the side of the Fotga remote, there is a selector switch and it can be in photo or video mode, and you'll need to put the switch towards photo mode. And yes, you'll need to do this even if you're going to be recording video with the GH5. Putting the remote in photo mode will allow the shutter button on the remote to be able to set our focus properly later. Then, trust me here, take your GH5 out of manual focus mode with the physical switch on the back of the camera. I know it's a scary thought, but you'll need to be in either autofocus single mode or autofocus continuous here on the focus switch. And I've been keeping mine in the autofocus single position, but don't worry, we won't actually be letting the GH5 use continuous or any autofocus modes really, but that switch has to be in either AFS or AFC for the remote to work properly. Number 5, then we go into the GH5 menu and we have to do a few things there. First, go to the wrench icon with a little letter C next to it, then go to the focus release shutter page on page 1 of 7 and set the shutter AF to on. And this setting will allow you to perform a single point autofocus when you half press down the shutter button on the camera itself. And even though you won't usually be doing this with the shutter button on the camera, you still have to have this enabled for the remote to work properly. And actually, I have this enabled on all of my cameras. I like that half press on the shutter button to grab focus, then I can just take pictures willy-nilly as needed. Next, still within the wrench with the little letter C next to it, go back and then go to the operations subsection, go to page 4 of 7 and set both the video button and the video REC button remote options to on. Next, back out and go to the second little video camera icon, the one without the letter M next to it, go to page 1 of 4. And I always make sure that this setting here that says AFS/AFF is set to AFS or autofocus single. If it's on the AFF mode, then when you have the manual switch on the back set to autofocus single, the camera might still try to help you autofocus in that situation. So I just set it to AFS instead of AFF. Next, and this is the important one, go to the next option down, which is continuous AF or continuous autofocus, and turn it to off. If you previously had this setting set to mode 2, like I always did, then if you do have your camera in video mode and in autofocus single or autofocus continuous with a little switch on the back of the camera, then the camera would always autofocus or try to autofocus even if you're not actively recording. And we don't want that because number 1, we don't want the camera to be able to use continuous autofocus at all. We want our Fotga remote to be the only thing that can grab focus and only when we half press that shutter button on the remote itself. And number 2, the only way to make the Fotga remote be able to do that is to have the camera in one of those autofocus modes on the focus switch on the back of the camera. Again, either AFS or AFC. Because the wired remote won't work at all if the focus switch on the back of the camera is in the manual focus position. So because we're in an autofocus mode on the physical switch, we will want to turn off this autofocus setting here in the menu. And that should be it for the settings in the menu. Then I set my autofocus zone on the camera to face/eye detection, and doing this limits the GH5 on what to look for in the frame, yet still enables the camera to find and track my face, but won't grab or autofocus on my face until I press that shutter button halfway down. And the reason it will still track but not grab focus until I do that is because we turned off that continuous autofocus setting in the menu. So if I unfocus myself, hang on. There, now I'm out of focus on purpose, and you can see that the GH5 still detects and tracks my face, but it won't actually focus yet. And this is what we want. Now you can use one of the other AF zones to change what the GH5 will look at or track when we focus with the remote, but since I want it to grab my face, I just leave it in face/eye detection mode here. I'll be back in focus momentarily, I promise. So with those things done, the Fotga remote plugged in and the switch on the remote set to photo mode, camera in video mode on the top dial if you're shooting video, shutter AF set to on in the menu, video button and video record button remote set to on in the menu, AFS/AFF set to AFS in the menu, continuous autofocus setting turned off in the menu, physical focus mode switch on the back of the GH5 set to autofocus single mode or autofocus continuous. Now we can use the shutter button on the remote just like the shutter button on the camera, and the shutter button on the remote has 2 steps of pressing down just like most cameras do. A half press will enable autofocus while you hold the button at that half press position, and be careful because you can actually start and stop recording with the button if you continue pressing on to that second position. Yep, I just stopped recording by continuing to press down to that second position on the shutter button. So I usually don't grab focus during recording. I usually just set my focus, hit record, get to recording, and leave my focus alone for the rest of the video. So we can actually focus up real quick. First, I'll get myself out of focus a bit. Hang on. There we go. And if we look at the output of the camera, even though I'm a bit out of focus, again, the GH5 sees and tracks my face. So now I can do that half press. The camera will enable autofocus temporarily. It finds and grabs and focuses on my eye. I release and I'm already recording, so I don't need to press any more buttons. I'm in focus. And again, I can just get on my way and get to recording. And if you look at the output of the GH5's menu here, I've actually stopped recording on the GH5 to show you a couple things. Number one, when I do half press, the box around my face turns green, actually finds my eye. I think it's on this side. Nope, it's on that eye, and it focuses. And while you're not recording on the camera, you'll also get that little green dot indicating that autofocus is currently active because I'm holding the shutter button down halfway. Now, if I start recording back on the GH5, if I do half press during recording, I'll still get the green box around my face, but that green button has turned to the red record button. So we don't get the double indication that autofocus is active, but again, it's a temporary thing. I can see the box around my face is green. I'm in focus. I'm going to let go, and again, continue on with the recording. So now the camera will just stay focused on that one point in space. It will not continue to change focus towards or away from the camera or left to right if I move left to right or towards or away from the camera, even though we can see that the camera is still actively tracking my face. So this just lets me have a faster way to turn on the camera, grab focus if I think I've changed positions or if the camera has lost power. And sure, it seems like a lot to do for an almost 8-year-old camera when I could just use one of my Sony cameras with its seemingly better autofocus, but just as I was about to start recording this video, my Sony FX30 was having a hard time finding and staying focused on my face. So I actually put the FX30 in manual focus mode for this recording and used the Sony app to touch on my face there so I would know that I would stay in focus in case I needed to cut to that side shot. So autofocus isn't always the answer, and hey, I'm still using the GH5 and this remote helps me, so I thought I'd try to help you. And there are USB versions of wired remotes and zoom controllers for other brands of cameras. I actually have one for my Sony cameras when I use it in live event settings, but most of those use the USB ports on some of those cameras and they do work just fine, but this particular remote is specific to that 2.5mm port, and neither my Sony a7 IV or the FX30 have a 2.5mm port, so just make sure you're getting accessories that work with your camera model. So that's it. Good luck. Happy focusing and recording, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.